Hi there folks, my name's Damien Bird, and in today's demonstration I'm going to show you how you can count and sum in Power Automate super efficiently, no apply to each, and you'll come away with some amazing ideas for super efficient flows. I promise you all of that. So if you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe, and without further ado, let's jump into the demonstration. So I'm going to kick this demo off from a SharePoint list. We can see on screen I have an employee expenses list. We have multiple expenses from different employees. There are 50 different expenses, and what I'd like to do is via Power Automate get all of those items to sum up the total of all those expenses. And we can see at the bottom we already have a sum in this list of 11,590, so that's what we'll compare against. And then I'd like to group by the distinct employees that are in this list and also sum up the total of their expenses, as well as getting a count for the number of expenses each employee has. Now, I also have a new view, group by sum and count, and we can see an example here. We have employee number 1, John Smith. He's got 3 expenses, and I haven't got a total for that on screen actually, but it amounts to $750, the 500, 250. So we're going to do this in Power Automate. Now, the reason that I showcase these ideas in my videos is I like to show you some efficient techniques within Power Automate that will try and keep you within the limits of your license. Now, I'm just bringing up this document here about the licensed user request limits. If you are a standard user with an enterprise agreement, an E3, E5, what's called a seeded license, then you actually get 6,000 API calls in a 24-hour period. Now, if you start building lots and lots of flows and they're really inefficient, you're going to hit these limits and your flows will get throttled and they'll start failing. You'll get 429 errors and you'll be thinking, what's going on here? Power Automate is rubbish. Well, actually, it's because you're building inefficient flows and you're not meeting the limitations of your license. So this is very much worth being aware of when you're building out a flow, and you'll see loads of examples in my videos showing you these amazing techniques for efficient flows. So this is the flow we're going to build. I'm going to do it step by step. You can see there are only 7 actions. I get the items, and then using a combination of selects and composes, I then will sum, I'll group by, and I'll sum those individual groups as well as counting the number of expenses per employee. And this amounts to 7 API calls. All the way from the get items down to the final select is 7 API calls. That is it. No apply to eaches and no need to initialize any variables. We can also see that if I pop open this raw output, this is what we're looking to achieve. I have an array that has the employee ID, the name, their email, the total cost, which remember was $750 for John Smith, and the count. So they've got 3 individual expenses. So I've now jumped over onto a new flow. I have the manual trigger and I also have get items for all those employee expenses in that new list that I've got, the employee expenses list. And the first action I want to add is a select. And select is an incredible action to become familiar with. What it will allow me to do is it will select from an array, so as in a table of data, in this case all the items from our list. And then if I switch to this text mode, I can go and insert a value, and that will give me an array of those values. And the aim here is to get an array of all the employee numbers throughout this list. So I've got 50 items. I know I've got 15 separate employees, albeit there are some duplicates. This will give me an array of all of the instances of those employee numbers, so all 50. There'll be duplicates, but what I can do is, using a little technique, I can get those distinct with a compose action. So I add in my compose. You'll have seen this in some of my other videos. If I go into the expression editor here and use the expression union with the open and close brackets, if we compare the output of the array from the select against itself, it'll actually give us the distinct values. So we'll go from 50 down to 15, and it's that we can then use to do the group by, because I now know who those distinct employee IDs are. So I'll add that, I'll actually save and test, and we can quickly review the history. With our flow complete, if I pop open the get items, we can have a look at the raw outputs, and that'll pop open on the right hand side here, and we can see all the data that's coming back. It's all part of this body value array with the square brackets, and our first item here is bringing back loads of data, loads of key values. lots of stuff we don't potentially need, and we can have a look at how to reduce that in the next iteration of our flow build. But more importantly, if I go into my select, what the select is doing is it's actually taking that as an input, so all that data that's come in from our get items, and then it's turning it into an array of, remember, just those employee IDs. So we will have 50 different numbers in here, or strings, and I know from this there are 15 unique values. So that's where we cleverly use that union expression in the compose, and you'll note that if we look at the output now, we just have those 15 unique numbers. They're not in any order, so maybe also be quite useful to sort those. So back into edit. In the get items, one of the ways to reduce the amount of data that's brought back is actually to have a look at some of these advanced parameters, and we have a limit columns by view. So I have this group by sum and count. That's one of the views that I've created. I could use the all items, in all honesty. It's the same in terms of columns. If I go into my compose, remember we've got that union, and I could actually sort that data using the sort expression. So I will wrap that union in sort, and that will now bring through those IDs in ascending order. If I want to reverse the order, there is also a reverse expression. The next part sounds pretty horrible, but it's all about converting this array from the get items into XML. So all you have to do is insert a compose. We can give it the name compose root, because at this point all we're doing is creating an object. So the squiggly open and close brackets followed by the word root in quotes here, and then some more squiggly brackets after our semicolon that I've just inserted, a key which you can call anything, but I'm going to call values, and then another semicolon followed by the body value that comes back from our get items. So all this does is it gives the structure required in order to convert the JSON into XML, and that's what gives us the power to do a lot of the searching and grouping by and summing without using an apply to each. Now you'll note that I'm getting an error. It's because I've forgotten to put my closing bracket there. So the brackets should match. I've got 2 opening and now I've got 2 closing, and that should be all happy. Next up, what I need to do is I need to convert that into XML. And again, the easiest way to do that is to use a compose. You could combine a lot of these expressions into one, but for ease, and because it's only one action, I'm doing it as separate actions just to try and help with the understanding. But we use this expression XML. I go into my dynamic content. I choose the output from the root that we've just created, which is our object in JSON. This will convert it into XML. I hit add, and we'll give this a name of compose XML. Now, when we looked at our SharePoint list at the beginning, we had a total sum for all of those values, and just summing up a big array of numbers can be very intensive on API calls. If you've got 100 different numbers and you're trying to loop through them using a variable and apply to each, of course that's going to be 100 API calls when you're updating your variable. So this trick alone is going to save you an awful lot of API calls just for summing up numbers in an array. And in order to do that, again, you won't be surprised to hear, I'm going to use a compose action. I'm going to give that the name compose total, and we're going to see a bit of XML now. So I'll go into the expression bar here, and I'm going to type in XPath. And what XPath allows me to do, it allows me to pass in an input, which must be XML, so the output of our compose XML. And then as a second parameter, we need to pass in an expression. So you'll see I've put in double quotes here. And in order to sum up those values, I need to use an expression called sum. So I'll type in sum, and then we need to identify the elements in our XML. Now this sounds, again, complicated, but I'll show you a little tool that I use. It's incredibly handy. But for this, I want to get, with a wildcard, 2 double slashes, root, which is the name of the key that we have in the object above, followed by 2 more forward slashes to hit the cost element, or the cost key that we have. It's the name of the column, basically, that I have in the SharePoint list or the data source. So we'll have a look at this in the history. It'll make a lot more sense then, but if I hit the add button, it's accepted, everything is happy. and we can go ahead and save test and have a look at the flow history. So with the flow complete, remember we made some changes to the get items to reduce the amount of data that was being returned. So have a look at the raw outputs and we have a look at that body value. If you can cast your memory back, we did have a lot of extra information in there. There are still some system values, but a lot of the data related to who owned it and who created it, etc. has been removed. So it's simplified that data structure. If I go into the compose that we've got here, remember I used that sort as well. So these numbers are now not only distinct, but also sorted from 0 through to 15. Then if we have a look at our compose route, remember what we're doing is we're taking that array that comes in from get items and we're just simply changing the structure. So if I look at the raw outputs, all I've done is added in a root and a values, and then I've passed in that array of data that comes back from get items. And because I've managed to do that, I can then look at the compose XML and pop open the raw output here. Oh, it doesn't display very well, but if we have a look on the left hand side, you can see what looks like XML, and it's this that allows us to then use XPath. And I'm actually going to copy this and paste it into a tool and show you why I used that sum expression. So I'll take advantage of this new copy feature here and copy that to my clipboard. We'll have a look at this compose total, which should be that 11,590. It's currently 0, so I've obviously got a mistake in there somewhere, but this is perfect chance to go and explore why. So the next tool I'd like to show you, and I've shown before in some of my videos, is XPaather. It allows me to paste in some sample XML, which I have on my clipboard. I can format, and hopefully, there we go, we've got all that data, which is all the items from our SharePoint list. And at the very top, you can see an example of an XPath expression. Now, if I hold down the control button, I can actually select different elements and different strings, and you can see the expressions are being constructed there and showing me how you select different values. So this is what we're ultimately creating. We're passing across an expression into Power Automate via that XPath in order to sum up the total. Now, whilst the sum is returning 0, if I go back into edit and have a look at the expression that I've passed across, I can go and grab the sum and the expression and I can pass it into the query at the top here. I'll just remove the quote and you can see, in fact, yes, the value being returned is 0. Now, the reason I believe that is possibly happening is because it's case sensitive and cost should have a capital C, which that is the reason. We can see now we've got 11,590 being returned. So a very easy fix for our flow. All I need to do is put in an uppercase C and that will then allow us to get back the total, and we can go ahead and save and test that. So if we look at the latest run, the latest value in that compose total is indeed 11,590. So case sensitive, make sure you keep an eye out for that when creating these XML expressions. So the next thing I'd like to do is to create a group by, and with that group by I'd then like to get the number of expenses and also the total of expenses. So this is slightly more complex. I'll put the flow into the edit mode again and I'm going to use a select. So this select is going to use the distinct employee numbers, and we've got that of course in the compose action that we created at the top here. So the compose outputs, we have in this particular one here sorted in numerical order, the union, which is the distinct values, and I'm using that as the input for our select. And then what I'd like to retrieve back is the employee ID, and I'm just putting in place some placeholders, their name, their email address, because of course I might want to email them individually. I want the total cost, and I'd also like the count of transactions. So the employee ID is actually relatively straightforward to retrieve back because we're passing in an array of all those employee IDs. The expression for the employee ID is actually just item open close brackets. So I can type in item open close brackets and that will get me the employee ID because this loops through the array and then hunts down those values that we provide as expressions. So I can add that in there. No idea why it's showing as body value, but I'll put that down to maybe a bug and hopefully when it saves it will correct itself. When it comes to the name, what we're looking to do is we want to use XPath, and the XPath is going to be very similar to the expression that we created for the total. So to get myself started with an expression, I'll pop open the expression tab here for the total. I'm going to copy that expression, go back into my select, into the value here, and then we'll paste that expression in. So at the moment, it's going to use XPath on that compose XML, and it will sum up the cost. But of course, what I want is the name. If we jump across onto XPaather, and I'll hold down Control, and if I want to get someone's name, we can see we construct an expression like so. So values, name, and then text. And these integers here represent the element that's been selected, so the first and the first name and the first text value as well. That allows me to get Michael Shen back. So courtesy of ChatGPT and a bit of experience with XML, I'm going to write the following expression where I'm getting the values, which is basically everything, but then we're going to search by the employee number, which is one of the cells or one of the elements within our XML, equaling 001. If I put in place that closing bracket, we can see on the right hand side it gets all three examples of the data where the employee is equal to 001. Then with that, I want to get back just their name, so / name, and I only want the first example of their name. So I can actually wrap this in the opening and closing brackets here and select the first, which just so happens to be the number 1. We can now see we've got John Smith. So that gets us back the string. I can also convert it into text with this expression here, and this will set us up nicely for our Power Automate flow. So I'll copy that. I'll jump into Power Automate and I will replace this whole expression here, which is equal to sum, with the expression that I've just built that will get us the name of that individual. And I can also at the same time copy this because it's going to be almost identical for the email. Now you're probably thinking at this point, this is not dynamic. This is going to get employee number 001 for all loops. Well, that's true, but we'll stick with this for now and we can work on it. Into the expression bar again, I'm going to paste this in, and rather than the name, I'm now going to get the email. Simple update there, and we can add that in. Now the cost is the total cost. And so again, we're going to use an example of summing. And probably the best way to demonstrate this is to jump back onto XPaather, and we'll adjust this expression ever so slightly. So I'm going to take that off at the end here. I want to get the cost, and hopefully we're seeing some numbers there on the right hand side based on employee number. And all I want to do is I want to sum it. So if I prefix it with sum, we can now see we've gone from the 3 individual values to 750. And that, based on the employee number, gives us a total cost. Again, I can copy that, jump across into my flow here, into the expression bar, and if I use my Windows notepad with Windows V, I can actually bring up the previous XPath expression and I can overwrite that with the expression that I've just built, which is the summing. There we go, and we can hit add. Now the count is, again, same idea. All we want to do instead of a sum is to count. If I go back into XPaather, we can see I've got sum. If I change that to count, I now have 3, so I know there are 3 numbers. So back into Power Automate, I can actually just copy this expression here, and I can paste that expression in, but replace the word sum with count. So these functions, count, sum, they are case sensitive, so make sure they are lowercase. So we'll hit add and we can save and test and see what we get back. So with the flow complete, we can see the input is that array, which is our distinct employee IDs. And then as part of the output, we can now see we've got the name and the email, albeit those have come back as arrays. So there's a slight change I need to make to the expressions. But we can see we have the cost and the count, and the cost and the count is the same for all of them because it's not dynamic, same with the name and the email, but we're now going to use this employee ID, the 001, to dynamically update the expression that we're using in XPath. So previously I had a fixed value of 001, so we're always returning John Smith, but now we're going to make it dynamic and use the number in each of the loops within our select. So back into edit, first things first, what I'd like to do is make sure that I'm actually getting back just the name and just the email. So because it's returning an array, you've probably seen this before, I want to get the first value back. So in square brackets, I put in a number 0 and that will get our first. The alternative is to obviously wrap the expression in first. So I'll show you both examples depending on your preference. If I go to the start of this expression, which my mouse is not liking, I can type in first and I can put in a closing bracket. There we go. And that is exactly the same idea as putting question mark and 0 in square brackets. So what we really need to do now is to make this number 001 dynamic. And in fact, let's pop open this expression bar. Perfect. So we can see our whole expression here. And what we want to do is make that 001 dynamic. So let's try and break this expression up a bit within our text editor. So everything up until this bracket here is in relation to the string that gets passed. So this string that I'm highlighting is the one that gets passed to our XPath expression in order to get the employee equal to 001. But we're going to create a concatenation. So there's an expression concat, and I can type that in here. Concat with an opening bracket. It's kindly put in a closing bracket, which I don't need, but I'll remove that and go to the very end and put my closing bracket. So that marks the end of my concatenation as things stand. But what I want to do is I want to create a concatenation with the dynamic value item in the middle here. So I've highlighted 001. I'm actually going to remove that with a comma, and I'm going to put in another comma as a placeholder for item. We can put in item with the open close brackets there. And we need to finish off this concatenation. So it needs two strings, the first of which will take us up to this equals. So I can put in a single quote. It's kindly put in 2, but I'll remove one. There we go. And then we want the third string, which is after the item, which is our employee number, to start from here. So I can put in a single quote. Again, it's kindly put in 2, but I'll remove one. And so now we've got a concatenation of this opening part of the expression, the dynamic value for item, which is our employee number, and then the final part of our expression. And then the very bit at the end here, as we remember, is to get the first value from the array that's returned, because in the test we saw that an array was being returned. Now if I hit update, everything should be good, and we just need to do exactly the same thing to the next 4 expressions. So I'll go a bit faster this time, hopefully. I concat, open brackets, I'll go very much to the end here and put in a closing bracket, and then 001 I can delete, I can put in some quotes, and I can put in a couple of commas and item open close brackets, and hopefully again we can see from this that we have our concat, we have our first string, we have our dynamic value, and then we have our second string up to there. Everything being good, hit update, it's happy. And then let's just do the same to these other 2. I quite like this new feature, being able to pop open this expression bar and also work off of different return lines. So the sum, again, if I put in a concat, an opening bracket, remove that one that's inserted, stick another bracket at the end to close off that concatenation. I can highlight that 001, and I'm using things like Shift and Control and my cursor keys here to do the highlights. There's no mouse involved. And we can put a single quote and also another single quote there. It's putting in 2, and then stick item in the middle. And then last but not least, same again, I'll pop open that expression bar, I'll put in concat, jump to the very end, put the closing bracket, and we can highlight the 001, put in the single quotes, a couple of commas, type in item with the open close brackets, update, and let's save and test. So interestingly, when I've come to save that, I've got an error message, and after a bit of exploring and looking at the new designer versus the old designer, I have discovered that by inserting return lines, there's actually under the bonnet /n being added in, and it causes these expressions to be invalid, because when I was explaining it, I was putting in returns and making it easier for you to view, but actually it's creating an invalid expression. So if you remove any return lines like so, and we'll remove that return line, I can then update the expression and hit save, and we'll find that actually Power Automate will now accept that expression, but obviously complain about another. So let's have a quick look. If I pop open the other expressions, expand the bar, so there's nothing wrong with that one. If I have a look at this one, expand it, there is a return there, so maybe I can remove that one. Perfect. Hit update. I'll check this one as well. Expand it. There are still return lines in that one, so if I just remove those return lines, hit the update and save, fingers crossed, we now have a happy flow and we can go ahead and test. So you'll see that the flow has run incredibly fast. We have all of those actions now that we're totaling up that initial total of 11,590, which is all of those items, and it would just be as fast with 1,000 or 10,000 potentially, maybe slightly slower, but not as slow as an apply to each. And if we now have a look at the select, where we've got that input again with the employee numbers from 001 all the way to 0015, if I pop open the raw output, we can now see we've got all of our different employees, their names, their totals, their counts, because we've now made those XPath expressions dynamic by passing in their employee ID as part of that concatenated expression. Now, if you're building this and really struggling to get XML to work, my suggestion would be to, of course, use XPath to explore the expressions. But then if you're getting loads of errors in Power Automate, what I'd maybe suggest you do is, instead of doing everything in the one expression here, you see I've got XPath and the output and the concatenation, is actually just to create an array using concat. So you could just generate the expression. So if I was to give you an example all the way up to this point here, this is a concatenation that creates an expression. And in fact, if I was to copy that right now and put that into a new field, I could say XML, put the expression into the expression bar here and add it. If we save and test it, I'll show you what I mean. So the flow run, if I look at the output again, I can now see that I've actually got an XML expression here. And this one is set up for employee number 2. So if I was to copy this to my clipboard, I can jump back onto XPaather and I can test out that expression. And we can see it returns Mary Johnson. So I know that I've generated a valid XPath expression using Power Automate. I've validated it in XPaather, and I could now take that value or take that expression that I've created and then add it into the full XPath expression to retrieve those values. So I'll just get rid of that XPath expression there. The things you can do with this data, because it's now nicely structured, one of the first things you could do is just to create an HTML table. So of course, with a create HTML, you pass in an array, and our select is an array. And that will give us a really nice summary of all of our totals, the count, and the employees and the employees' email addresses all into a table, which of course you could then pass to an email and send out to the team. The other thing you can do is you could loop through. So I could do an apply to each. And with that apply to each, I could loop through the output of our select, and then that would allow me to email each of those employees. So I can put that output in there. I can add in an action to send an email. And with that send an email action, I could then send each member of staff an update with regards to their expenses, the fact that they had X amount of expenses and their totals were Y. So in order to do that, you've got two options. You can either use parse JSON, and the way you do that is you would add in a parse JSON, you would pass in the sample output from your history, and that would create your dynamic expressions. The other way is just to write expressions. So because I've passed the output from this select into my apply to each, in terms of accessing the values in my send an email, all I need to do is create expressions based on this map. So it would be item, open close brackets, and then their name or their email or the cost or the count. So in order to do that as a demonstration, if I go into 2, enter a custom value, and if I type in item, open close brackets, question mark, square brackets, single quotes, I can type in email. This is not case sensitive, so you don't need to worry so much here. And I can add in the email. The subject could be the employee ID. So I could put in employee ID, and I could also add in some text to say your expense summary, for instance. We can then go into the body and say that your 3 or 4 expenses, so we can use item open close brackets and count, that'll get us the number. So this will say your 3 expenses for however many dollars, which was cost. So I'm pasting in an old expression, so cost, so item cost. So your 3 expenses for $750 will have been received and will be reviewed in due course. Now, of course, you could take this a lot further. You could generate an approval process for each of those users. And if you wanted to still bring in the expenses for that employee as another table, then you could use a filter array action based on their employee ID. So why don't we just demonstrate that? If we add in a filter array action at the top here, we can go and filter our original array of data from our SharePoint list, the body values. We're checking to see where the employee ID, employee number here, is equal to the emp ID, which is part of this apply to each loop. Now the difference here, if I was to write an expression, rather than it being the item, open close brackets, the filter array actually has its own context for item, because we have, as you can see here, item employee number that refers to this array. So if I was to type in item here, it refer to this level within this filter array. So what I actually need to use in the dynamic content is current item. So you can see here, current item. And then in square brackets, I can put in emp ID, because I'm wanting to get the employee ID from within this apply to each, not from within this array here. So I can hit add. That will now compare the employee ID in this array against the employee ID in this loop for the apply to each. We should get back 3 in the first loop and however many in the next loop. And then I want to create an HTML table, which will be a nice personalized HTML table for each of the employees to let them know their expenses. If I go into the dynamic content here, we can see that we're getting the body back as one of the dynamic values. This is in fact a bug. I've reported it. What we need to do is go into the functions or the expression editor into dynamic content, and you'll see that you have outputs as now one of those options. So this is the expression you're looking for. It might be there first time, but if you go and add that in, that will create us a lovely HTML table based on the filtered values, and we can add that into our email here and say, here is a summary of your expenses. And with that, we can add in the dynamic value for the output from our HTML table. So this pretty much concludes the demonstration. I'll save it, I'll test it, we'll make sure that everything that comes back is as expected. But you have seen now how to sum up a large array of numbers. We've managed to group them by getting the distinct values, and then with those distinct values we're using XPath to both sum and count the number of expenses from that large array using 6 actions, some advanced expressions, but will give you an incredibly efficient flow. So our flow almost completed. I can see that the filter array is completed, and if we have a look, we've got all this as input, but if I look at the output, hopefully it is just based on employee number 3. So we can see this one here is for John Smith, also John Smith, and also John Smith. So certainly the filtering is working, and if I step through the different loops, we should hopefully again see in the outputs we've got different groups. So Sarah, in this case, we've got all of Sarah's expenses. So certainly the filter has worked, but the create an HTML table has failed because the property is of type object. So that means that I'm passing through an object rather than an array. And we can have a look at the input here, and we can see we have a from and a body. So we actually want to pass this through, not all this stuff prior, which is an object. So wrong expression, even though I said it was one to look out for, I've still not got the right expression. And if we go into the edit, again, jump in here, we are using outputs. In fact, I think it should be body. So if we delete that, I'll just quickly look at the dynamic content again. We've got body list of items. If I hover over that, or look at the code view, we can see the expression, which is outputs a body value, which I don't believe is correct. And so I can see that that has failed. Also, if I go into edit and then we'll go into the classic designer and see what dynamic values are available here, into the apply to each, into our create HTML, we can remove this expression and we can see the filter array has a body, which sounds a lot better. So the expression is body with the name of the filter array in single quotes. We can save and we can test it in the trusty classic and reminisce about our old friend classic designer. So the apply to each is running. There are 15 loops. I could of course turn on concurrency if I wanted to speed this up, but we can see it's completed successfully. If I go into my send an email action, I can see that those various emails have been sent. I really hope that Sarah Miller doesn't exist at internet.xyz. And if I jump into my Outlook email, we can see in my sent items, I have all of these different emails to those different individuals with their summary of their expenses. Yes, the table is pretty horrific. And of course, if you want to edit that table, you can do so with the advanced options. But ultimately, what we've demonstrated now is the summary. By using the group by, we've managed to get that there are 4 expenses, $820 in total, and then we have our table with those expenses, the 40, 300, 300 and 180, which is 820.